Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Kalispera. I guess we'll tell you a little bit about ourselves. My name is Madeline Singas. I am a judge on the Court of Appeals in New York State. In New York, the Court of Appeals is the highest court of the state. I'm one of 7 judges. Before I was a judge, I was the district attorney of Nassau County on Long Island, and I represented about 1.4 million people. I was a prosecutor since I graduated law school in 1991, so I've been doing this a long time.
And good afternoon. My name is Marisol Orihuela. I'm a clinical professor at Yale Law School. Prior to teaching, I've been teaching for 7 years. Prior to teaching, I have a background as a lawyer in immigrant rights, civil rights, and criminal defense. At the law school I've been working on a number of clinics, both doing criminal justice reform, immigrant rights, and most recently established a new clinic called the Mental Health Justice Clinic, where we do advocacy and policy reform, both in the criminal and civil systems through a mental disability lens. Yeah. So just to contextualize the conversation that we're having today, we just want to real simple, but be very straightforward about the crisis of mental health in the criminal courts. Conservative estimates are that about half of the prison population in the U.S. prisons have been diagnosed with a mental health condition. That's diagnosed, so if someone hasn't been diagnosed, then numbers could be higher. Some estimates go up to about 3/4 of the prison population. In addition, over half of people in U.S. prisons have a substance use disorder or self-identify as having substance use challenges. So we have a huge number of people in prisons, and then even more people who come through the criminal court system that may not necessarily go to prison, but are facing potential criminal liability, and that the criminal courts have to address and handle through its process. And that is, I think, where we'll start. So, Judge Singas, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what are some of the positive trends that you've experienced in your work in how the U.S. criminal court system handles mental health, and what are some of the challenges that you've seen?
Yeah, well, those numbers are pretty sobering, and mental health enters the court systems most dramatically in the criminal court context, and you may have read about things like subway killings and people being pushed into the subways. Those always hit the front pages of the papers. But there are mental health issues throughout the law and through all of our courts, whether it's in family courts or guardianships or civil confinement. It's a real issue as we try to do our work as judges and litigants, confronting mental health issues. And there are some other statistics that people with serious mental illness are 10 times more likely to be in a prison as opposed to being in a hospital. So it's an issue that New York State has tried to confront head-on, and it's not easy. Throughout my career, I have seen people with behavioral issues and mental health issues just cycling through the system over and over again, not getting the services and the help that they need, and recidivating at really high rates, and ultimately we're not helping that person, and we're really not helping to keep the public safe. So New York State started courts. There's a mental health court in every county. There's 62 counties in New York State where people that are accused of crimes who have mental health issues go to a specialized court. The judge in that courtroom has training, the prosecutors sometimes have training, and there's a whole contingency of support staff there, social workers, psychologists, assessing that person individually to see what needs do they have specifically. And we talked a little bit, I heard some of the speakers this morning talking about individualized medical care, precision medical care. It's sort of the same context, understanding that we can't take a cookie cutter approach. People have different needs and suffer at different levels. So particularizing our services towards that individual specifically increases our ability to have better outcomes and prevent recidivism in the future. So that's happened about in the last 2 decades. I think that's been a really positive impact on the general population and for this population specifically. Of course, there are challenges because we don't have enough resources in New York State to support the kinds of services that are necessary to help these people achieve the most positive outcomes. So, there are challenges there. There are challenges with how long it takes because, there's no easy fix. There's no quick fix. So a lot of the programming that comes out of those courtrooms are 12 to 18 months, sometimes 2 years. Sometimes those are not realistic for defendants to take a 2-year plea when they could go to other court parts and get a quicker resolution of their case. So those are some of the challenges that we have, and finding the people to serve in these specialized courts. There's a real lack of therapists and social workers that are working in this community. It's really challenging work and a steady diet of that every day, from some of the most minor crimes to some of the most really violent. Sometimes people just opt out and say, you know what, I'd rather work in a hospital setting outside of a courtroom. So those are some of the challenges that we see, but that individualized attention I see as something really positive.
As a former public defender and someone who now, my academic interests include how the criminal courts and other court systems handle mental health, I agree that individualized attention and an increased recognition in the criminal courts about how ill-suited prisons can be for people with mental health conditions, both because they don't have a therapeutic effect. Often they don't even provide close to adequate mental health treatment, and the mental health treatment gets rationed in a way that someone really needs to be in crisis to be able to access them, so there's no ongoing, consistent treatment in them. And also because it's not solving the problem of the revolving door that Judge Singas introduced. Some of the challenges that I think I've identified and feel in the work that I do is that the United States remains incredibly committed to a very punitive system. And so when we talk about mental health as something that we want to get out of the criminal courts, and yet the majority of people who are processed in our criminal courts have a mental health condition, that is quite a task. And our commitment in the US to a punitive response, you see it both in how vast our criminal statutes are, and sometimes the things that make the headlines are things like an awful killing in the subway. But the things that happen every day in our courts include disorderly conduct and vagrancy and loitering and lots of little offenses that people with mental health conditions is often a way that they come into the courts. But we also see it in the treatment of people in prison. So I live and work in Connecticut. Connecticut is known as a generally pretty liberal state, has plenty of progressive policies, both in criminal law and outside criminal law. Just last year, in 2022, did we as a state ban the use of solitary confinement for people who have a mental health condition? And that has long violated international norms. When you learn about the impact of solitary confinement on people with mental health conditions, it's shocking and awful, and it's inhumane. And yet, even in a state of Connecticut, it takes us that long, and it's been that recent that we decide to severely curtail it. So we've done great steps, we recognize an issue, and yet we have a long ways to go. And something like mental health courts as providing an alternative can be so useful for someone for whom it works. But when it doesn't work, the only tools that are available currently in the criminal system are incarceration. So when someone doesn't complete a treatment program, doesn't abide by the rules of the mental health court, where they end up is prison, a place that we know doesn't help them.
Yeah, and that's actually something that we're ill-equipped to deal with, because when you think about it, in most instances, if someone is having some kind of episode, the first people called to that scene are police officers. Our response is a law enforcement response as opposed to a public health response. And that sets up the situation where if they're not taking someone to a hospital, the only other place they're taking them to is a prison. And, you know, a lot of the thinking behind that is, you know, there's sort of been this abandonment of mental health services and a recognition that someone in crisis can't be left out because they may be a danger to themselves or a danger to someone else. So there has to be some action taken. And we as a society have to have a reckoning and build the systems that allow us to have public health responses to people in crisis. So it's sort of like, I don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg, but it is a conversation that we have as a court system. I used to have every day as a district attorney. In fact, New York has started the Council of Chief Judges, all chief judges of all of our states in the United States met and created a task force on mental health and came up with a number of recommendations that are being implemented now, 3 years later, throughout the United States. And a lot of it is common sense. Just bring in the mental health professionals so that we can have the conversations with them, so that they can give us the support and the expertise. So when you think about it, and the first person on the scene is a police officer with a gun that takes this person into a jail setting, that's not a therapeutic setting, and that person's condition is usually exacerbated rather than alleviated. So beginning to have those conversations and not have a siloed approach to these issues, instead of trying to have an interdisciplinary approach, I think is vital. And I think that a conference like this, I've heard this theme a lot, like there's not one institution that can do this by itself. As a community, we have to make the commitment to putting in the hard work so that we can get people the services and the help that they need. At earlier and earlier stages, often I felt that once someone got to us and committed either a violent crime or was suffering tremendously from mental illness, there weren't many options left to us as an institution. And I used to often scratch my head and say, how did this person get to this point without someone else intervening? You know, how are they in front of me as a judge without teachers, parents, society, a community, a religious institution, someone saying, this person needs help and we need to get them the services that they need. So,
you know, for those of you that were here in the prior panel on the normalization of gun violence, one of the things that in the criminal courts we talk more and more about now is adverse childhood experiences, and how many individuals who end up engaging in behavior that is criminal and proceed to sentencing have lived through significant number of adverse childhood experiences. And these social determinants of health are not, they're social determinants also of criminal system involvement. Now, I do think we need to be careful about, I'm very much pro early intervention, but how we intervene. You know, in the United States, we've taken an approach where our intervention at schools has meant police involvement at schools. And what's developed there is taking kids out of schools and removing them from schools both prevents them from getting an education that they need and also makes it more likely that they end up in the criminal justice system. So how we intervene is hugely important. And even as bringing mental health professionals into the criminal system, it can be incredibly positive. But it also, our system of incorporating mental health professionals through the criminal courts right now is a system of mandated treatment. And so you have think think about if the therapist that you have isn't one that you choose. Think about if you don't develop a good rapport with them, or I should say, if they don't develop a good rapport with you, it doesn't matter. You have to continue seeing them. And if you don't, you'll go to prison. There are mistrust issues that are actually quite antithetical to the development of a strong therapeutic relationship, which is one of the markers of how effective therapy can be. So even a public health approach is a wonderful approach, but we need to actually fully commit to that. And something just to illustrate how hard this can be for us in the United States, the city of New Haven, my city, recently started a program called Compass. It's a crisis response system. It's meant to hopefully replace police being the first responders to mental health crises. A lot of people, very hard workers, put a lot of work into this. And when it got started, that team could not get to being the first responders without police. So all the calls, if you believe someone is in crisis and you want Compass to respond, that it's a team, social workers, mental health professionals, but they have to right now be accompanied with police. So even our extraction of police as first responders is incredibly difficult for us to do.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part is of that mandatory, those mandatory services arise in a place like a mental health court, because a judge will say, oh, you can have this plea, and it'll be 18 months of treatment, which is mandated. If you complete that successfully, then your case will be dismissed. Again, a recognition that people with criminal convictions makes it that much harder to overcome the obstacles that they're already facing. So yes, unfortunately, there aren't the resources to get people the therapists that they feel more closely aligned with or that will help them. We're in a point in our courts where we're just trying to get therapists in there to have the discussions and give the support to someone so that they can successfully complete and have their case dismissed if it's so warranted. They're really very complex issues surrounding this, and there really isn't an easy fix.
And maybe we can turn thinking about the future. If you were to make recommendations, sort of what are the things that you would like to see either more of or less of in the criminal court systems in regard to mental health?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the bottom line is we need more services. There are not enough people doing the work that's important to be done. And we need earlier intervention, earlier recognition of distress signals and signs that someone's in trouble. Again, I didn't like looking out at someone and saying, wow, where has this person been? That there's been no one in their life to help them, and now we're at this point, and now it's become a criminal justice issue when it should have been maybe an early childhood or educational issue. So I think more services. I think this idea of not siloing information and bringing in different people and destigmatizing mental health issues, because a lot of people just didn't get the help that they needed because they never wanted to reach out and ask for the help. And families in crisis are very reluctant to say that they need help. And I think conferences like this, educating a community about that it's not shameful, advocating for therapy, destigmatizing it so that we can get people the resources and help that they need are absolutely something that we need to do more of and have more conversations around. And also, there are some people that are going to stay in jail. They're going to be incarcerated. Their crimes might be too serious. Their issues might be too severe. Can we get them the help in prison? That's the other issue. Sometimes people would cycle out of prisons and jails and end up in a worse position than they were before they got in because there are no services while they were incarcerated to assist them. And you can do that, and we just need to do more of it to understand that when someone's incarcerated, someone incarcerated for a mental health committed crime is different than another kind of prisoner, and get them the resources that they need while they're in to help them reintegrate into society. Putting someone in prison, giving them no services, and then letting them out 8 months later, 2 years later, 3 years later, without a support system, without a web of support to help them get housing, get a job, get their degrees, we're just setting people up for failure. So I think it's our obligation to make sure that we stop doing that.
I would just add to that severely curtailing lengthy sentences, which the U.S. just overuses, and the shorter time we have people in prison, particularly people with mental health condition, the sooner and the faster we can get to alternative approaches. But I'm really hopeful about young people. They just reject what they don't think is right. And the young people that I see working with law students have taught me so much about they're not putting up with diagnostic labels the way we do with, and the aggravating and the stigmatization of many mental health conditions, which is still incredibly prevalent in our courts. Even some federal courts even call some mental disabilities aggravating just because someone has them. Absolutely no empathy. So increasing empathy toward mental health conditions and increasing awareness that young people bring, I think is critical to actually fundamental change of how we handle them in the criminal courts.
I think we're going to...
I think we're moving to Q&A?
Yeah, I think we're moving to Q&A. I think Maria's coming back.
Thank you very much for this insightful discussion. So now I would like to kick off the Q&A with a personal question. Are there successful models or programs from other countries that the United States can learn from when it comes to treatment of individuals with mental health conditions who have committed crimes?
You know, for me, I really think that we need a multi-pronged approach. So we're not solving this issue just through criminal court interventions. This is what's happened in criminal courts is a reflection of what's happening in our society. And when you look at some of the the reasons why people end up getting involved, they're complex, they always are. But they include things like housing instability, food instability, poverty, how they get treated in schools, education. So we need a different approach to all of those issues. We have and I know we'll be talking about a housing crisis in New York City, but we have a housing crisis all over our country. So we both need better services broadly in society and better mental health services, and we need reduced incarceration. We need to stop overusing prisons. It does not work. So countries like Sweden and Germany that both have a much lower rate of incarceration than the United States and have much better access to community-based health services, I think would be good models.
Yeah, I also think, I mean, I know the United States doesn't like to think they can learn from anybody, but the Netherlands is doing some really interesting work with people that are incarcerated, giving them the services that they need, just that what I was talking about, housing them separately, allowing them to come and go to help that reintegration process, not wearing uniforms even when they're incarcerated, just giving them the tools, putting schools in there so that they can get the tools they need before they're released. You know, too often in the United States, we release people before we give them what they need to succeed. We're just setting people up for failure. The Netherlands is doing a really good job of figuring out how to have people serve sentences and at the same time set them up for success once they're out. And they include the medical community very intensely in that process, which becomes really important, I think.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer. It's now time for the question from the audience, so I'm inviting you to raise your hands and the microphone will reach out to you. Yes, you first.
Thank you so much for your thoughts and insights. I'm curious, you talk a lot about how we're setting people who are in prison when they leave prison up for failure. But do you not think that that's also being perpetuated by the private prison system that relies on not giving people the support they need because they're relying on the people going back into the system? And how do you sort of address that and reconcile that with the work that you're doing?
I can, sure. I think yes and. So yes, a private prison system is designed to save costs, maximize efficiency. It is not meant to provide a ton of services that are really expensive. Good mental health treatment is not affordable. It's actually quite complicated. It can take a long time. It can take a lot of money. And so private prisons are not, they're not designed for that. But prisons are also not designed for that. That's not what really takes place at prisons. And being locked in a cage, it's very hard to do therapeutic work while being locked in a cage. Just even think about how great treatment facilities will often be quite comfortable. And that is one of the things. That is some of the work that some European countries are doing in trying to change the way prisons look, having them well designed. We are very, very far away from the U.S. So I think you're absolutely right as to private prisons, but I don't want to limit the critique to private prisons because I don't think it's just about the privatization of corrections.
Yeah, again, I think that's all part of the overall problems that we're having in the United States with incarceration and lack of services and non-intervention earlier before we get to that point. And again, it's not just a problem that the judiciary could solve or that any one group, like we have to look, our legislators have to look at the privatization of facilities, and our executives have to take a bigger stand and study that as well. So until we all commit equally to these issues and get the input from the people that are actually the decision makers, we're just putting Band-Aids on huge problems, and they're just self-perpetuating at that point. So yeah, these are really complex issues, and we need to keep having conversations around them.
Yes. Please give a big applause to our speakers. Thank you very much.